Good afternoon. I'd like to assure you you are in the right place for the research forum. We're just going to wait another minute or so to let more participants sign in, and then we'll start talking with Kate and Virlana. Well, good afternoon. I think we're going to get started. So just by way of a quick introduction, my name is Matt Turry, and along with my colleague Nadia Clifton here in Wilson Library, I help organize the Wilson Fellowship Program. One of the things that we do as a part of the fellowship program is we try to understand the work that's being accomplished in our research room. We don't always have the luxury, well, we rarely have the luxury of spending the type of time that our fellows are sort of permitted to look through our collections and really dig deeply into them. So this is a rare and really sort of exciting opportunity for us. We've been on a bit of a hiatus, but we're now resuming our research forums. The next one will be a month from now, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that at the end of this, at the conclusion of this program. What we're going to do today in terms of structure is we have two speakers. Kate Johnston is going to speak first for about a half hour, and then Virlana Shchuka is going to talk again for a half hour, and then we'll have some time at the end for some questions. We know that that's a little odd because you have to defer questions, but it allows us to make sure that people are able to present fully and we come together at the end. And sometimes questions cross boundaries, which may be the case here because some of the subject matter is sort of complementary. So, by way of introduction, we're going to begin our talks today with Kate Johnston. Um, from our point of view, I'll read you a little bit more about her bio, but she received, as Virlana did, a visiting researcher fellowship, which was really generously funded by the J. Carlisle Sitterson Fund for the Southern Historical Collection. And Kate is an assistant professor of history at Montana State University in Bozeman, where she studies race, slavery, the body, and the environment in the Atlantic world. Her recent book, The Nature of Slavery, which was published in 2022, examines race, labor, and a language of climate in the 18th century Atlantic. Her current project analyzes visual culture of women's bodies and race from the 17th to the 19th centuries. Today's presentation discusses wet nursing and enslaved motherhood, drawing on the research that she accomplished in Wilson Library last summer. The title of her talk today is Motherhood and Slavery in the Antebellum Atlantic. So, without further ado, Kate Johnston.
Thank you, Matt. And Thanks to all. I wanted to share with you today a little bit about the research that I accomplished last summer at the Wilson. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, I'm going to start with a brief story and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the material that I was reading this summer. So, to start, in the spring of 1847, Cecilia Dalton of North Carolina gave birth to her only child, a daughter. She'd married 2 years earlier, and right around the time of her wedding, her husband, possibly as a wedding gift, purchased an enslaved teenage girl named Phyllis. Cecilia became a mother the month she turned 33. Phyllis, who was 18 at the time, gave birth at approximately the same time. Cecilia had little interest in children and immediately handed her daughter Lizzie over to Phyllis, ordering Phyllis to nurse Lizzie along with her own baby. But Phyllis struggled to produce enough milk for her own child. And by the fall, the toll of nursing two babies proved too much for Phyllis, who, quote, failed in her milk. I'll return to that in a minute. But as a result, both children had to be hand fed, most likely subsisting largely on a diet of grain mixed with water. To her relief, Cecilia found that Lizzie was, quote, not half so cross since I took to feeding her constant. In all probability, Lizzie had been cross because she was undernourished, with her mother expecting Phyllis to supply enough milk for two babies while also performing various types of labor around the house. Cecilia made no mention of Phyllis's baby, who likely suffered even more malnourishment than Lizzie because the baby who nursed first received the richest and most nutritious part of Phyllis's milk. So I'm sharing this because I want to talk with you a bit today. This image is not the same Phyllis, but it is of a woman named Phyllis from around approximately the same time period. So I want to talk a little bit about wet nursing, but mostly just talking about Phyllis. Then I'll talk more about some of the collections, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about another woman named Kizzy, and then tell you some of my conclusions. So, Phyllis, um, this is right here. So I have three archival things I wanted to share. This right here is, and I hadn't thought about the fact that you wouldn't be able to see the whole thing because of the people over on the right, like me. But this is a bill of sale for Phyllis from May 28th, 1845. And it shows that John Dalton, who was at the time just about to or had just married Cecilia Dalton, paid $400 for Phyllis, who was 17 years old on August 4th next, right? So she's 16 when he buys her. She's going to turn 17 um, in August. Here, you actually can't see the part that is underlined, but at the end of this letter, this is a long letter between sisters, there's a line that says, Cindy, who is enslaved, says hello to all the enslaved people on the sisters' plantation. And then there's a part that you can't see, but it says she wants to know what Phyllis named her baby. And then here you have this letter, which is actually from the fall. Lizzie is growing on trying to crawl. I have to be careful to watch her now for fear of fire. She is almost weaned entirely from Phyllis. I feed her constant. Phyllis has failed in her milk, and both children have to be hand fed. But she is not half so cross since I took to feeding her constant. So this story is the kind of story I arrived at the Wilson hoping to find. I went seeking information about enslaved Black wet nurses who were forced to feed white babies, and I found nuggets such as this one, right? Brief mentions in letters about wet nursing. This story in particular was especially exciting because, unlike in other cases, the bill of sale for Phyllis was in the archives too. It was one of those really exciting finds that historians of slavery can only hope for. Um, and I'd been thinking about wet nursing and race and slavery on and off for a long time. And from what I could gather, it seemed like the Southern Historical Collection would be my best archival bet. Other historians had combed through personal papers and found mentions of the practice and had done really great work on it. So I was finding mentions of wet nursing. Sometimes it was unclear like, what the story was. Phyllis was almost the most complete story because we knew that she had a baby at the same time. We knew that she was wet nursing Lizzie. We knew when she was bought, right? We knew these things. But in some ways, it also felt a little bit like a dead end. Like, what am I going to do with this information? Um, and several historians have written articles and book chapters and books about wet nursing and slavery. And as I read through these family papers, I wasn't sure I had anything to add. But when I looked back at some of the letters, I realized a few things, and there was more than wet nursing here, right? And if I read carefully and consistently, I could pick out fragments of enslaved women's lives. So Cindy's comment about Phyllis's baby was a beginning here. And as I read, I began to record every mention of particular enslaved women who would kind of come up again and again, as well as brief stories about their health. So I looked in particular for stories about birth and motherhood, but I also took note of whatever I could find, right? Any kind of health for any enslaved person, man or woman. And I transcribed dozens and dozens and dozens of letters. And eventually I was able to weave together a few stories, although, of course, I recognize their limitations, right? Because these fragments are mediated by white people, by enslavers, and they can't really tell these women's stories on their own terms. But I still thought it was worthwhile to take note of them. And the result has ultimately become an article that is currently under review. So we'll see. But it weaves together one woman's story with a larger history of wet nursing. So today, I want to show you a few things I found in the collections and then talk a bit about uh, Kizzy's story. So the main collections I used, I looked through the Sarah Frances Hicks Williams letters, DeRosset family papers, some of the Lenoir family papers, and almost all of the Mary Hunter Kennedy papers, from where the bulk of my material is taken. So as I started reading, these are the kinds of things I began to find. So this is actually just about wet nursing, right? So this is Kate DeRosset, and her cousin is sick and unable to nurse her baby, who is suffering from hunger and not doing well. And then several days later, she writes that she has milk leg. So her left leg is swollen and painful. And so the doctors come and they do their doctoring practices, which is to bleed her a lot. Um, so she becomes very weak and her milk becomes dried up and she needs a wet nurse for the baby. Then 10 days later, she's dead, and the baby's actually doing better. This does nothing about this wet nurse. We don't know if she's white. We don't know if she's black. We don't know anything really about this wet nurse. But it was these kinds of fragments I went in hoping to piece together. From another collection, an entirely different kind of story that I found. So this is one type, right? Like why somebody would use a wet nurse. She gets sick, her milk dries up, then she dies. Another kind of fragment that I found sort of interesting is from the Sarah Frances Hicks Williams letters. So she has a daughter who she calls by various names, but at the time she's writing this letter, she calls her Lily. And she also has a nurse, and it's unclear whether this nurse is a wet nurse or not, whether she's enslaved, but I think from this letter that she is enslaved, because I'm reading all these and it's really unclear. But then we have Lizzie has a little boy, not quite a week old. Both are doing well. She's going to call him, and I forget what the name is, it's hidden, after her husband. But I'm going to write James that I call it after him. And what was striking to me about this one is Sarah Frances Hicks Williams, I believe she's from, I want to say New York, but she's from somewhere in the North. I have it in my notes. And she moves to the South and she's really against slavery, but over time, her letters begin to change. And this kind of comment, right, which says, well, this enslaved woman has chosen to name her baby this, but I'm going to call it something else, shows a change in her attitude, right? I'm not going to respect this enslaved mother and what she wants to do. I'm going to call this baby what I want to call it. The next thing I want to show you is just the way that you can actually, so all these white families are represented fairly well in the finding aids. The enslaved families less well, but there are hints that you can get a sense that for example, in the Mary Hunter Kennedy papers, there's a series of siblings who are all corresponding, and the enslaved people on their properties are often related to each other. So Cindy, which this is the same Cindy who wanted to know about Phyllis, right, will be confined in July or August, meaning she's going to have a baby. And she says, oh my goodness, we're going to have all of these enslaved children. But tell old Viney, who is enslaved on Cecilia's father's plantation, she will soon have lots of grandchildren because her daughter is Cindy and Cindy's daughter is Melvina. And so you can begin to put together some of these family histories. Here, right, these are just a couple of examples of letters about enslaved women who are pregnant or have had losses, right? I have another Louisa who is a sister to Cecilia. I have another young one on the road. I expect Amy is about 4 months or perhaps 5 advanced. She is very grunty. I have to physio her occasionally. I accuse her of eating dirt, but she denies it. I know she's not well from the looks of her skin, right? So here's a reference to enslaved women who are eating dirt, or maybe not, right? Because of the physical toll that pregnancy takes on their bodies. They're not getting enough minerals. They're not getting enough nutrients. And so this is something that sometimes happened. This tells us a little bit about Amy's condition. The next letter, also by the same person, Louisa, talks about Hetty, who had this child and went to sleep nursing it, fell asleep because she's exhausted, right? And she's doing all this work and she's nursing a child. She's exhausted. She fell asleep and she smothered it in her sleep. And of course, she's distraught about this, right? This is awful. And it comes up here. And I'm going to return to all this at the end. Finally, I want to talk a bit about, or maybe not finally, but I want to talk about Kizzy's story, because Kizzy is enslaved on a plantation in 19th century Missouri. So some of her family remains back in North Carolina. Her enslavers have taken her with them to Missouri to start a plantation there, or a farm, really. It's not even a plantation. And there's a lot that we can actually tell about what Kizzy went through, and I want to just talk about some of it. So here you have a letter. Kizzy has been sick for several days with pains after, whether she miscarried or anything of that kind, I cannot say, but it appears a good deal like it. So evidence of a potential miscarriage. There's other letters that talk about almost certain miscarriages. Here, she's pregnant. Kizzy is pregnant, and Melissa, her enslaver, who is sisters with Cecilia, says, I can't get her to tell me anything about it. But I really hope she has a son. And I'm going to tell you about this. And then here, she got married at Christmas. So we need not calculate on her supplying the place of a man always, as she was the stoutest. She took the axe and uses it well this winter. So this tells us a lot, right? This tells us she got married. We have a couple of letters dated before this that says she has a couple of children already. We end up learning in a later letter who she marries, a man named Osborne. We learn that one of the things that she's forced to do is chop firewood. And a letter here that I'll just, this letter suggests that Kizzy is actually serving as a wet nurse for Melissa. Because Melissa goes to help her sister Louisa with her newborn baby and says at the very end of this letter, I think I will leave my babe and help her out with hers. And so there's evidence that she and Kizzy have had babies at the same time. And not too long afterwards, she goes and leaves her baby. So presumably she is having Kizzy take care of this baby and wet nurse it. So there's a lot of evidence about things that happened to Kizzy. This one, she gave birth to a fine boy, the 26th of January. Later it says, Kizzy says it is the largest and smartest child she has ever had. I think so too. And I want to give her a fair chance to raise it. I don't want to make her work out this summer. It breaks a woman down and injures the child when they are so young. I know how it was 2 years ago with her and the child. So here we have evidence that she has this other new baby. And a couple things about this. Her enslavers frequently hire her out, right, to another family, and they apparently did so 2 years ago when she had another child. And this letter implies that this child got very ill and perhaps died because of the more stress on Kizzy, his mother, or her mother. And so we know that maybe Kizzy lost a child. There's more records of Kizzy's births, and later on when it sort of says she has 3 living children. Sometimes it's hard because the letters are not all dated. The other thing here is that right around the same time, there's a woman named Anne who's enslaved also by Kizzy's same enslaver. And Anne has a baby at the same time. And then the following month, Anne is sold away without her baby. Her baby has to stay behind. And so Kizzy then has to be wet nurse to Anne's baby. Anne loses her baby, right? She's sold away. So basically, there's a lot of different, Kizzy comes up in several different letters. She gives birth, she's sick, she might have miscarried, she got married, she's going to have another baby. There's a number of fragments of letters about what happens with Kizzy. There's, she's milker, they have milk cows. She won't do to skim the cream. I puzzled over this. I'm not sure why Melissa does not trust Kizzy to skim the cream. She ends up trusting Peggy, who also works there, to skim the cream. Then the next letter, Peggy is about to have a baby and Kizzy has a baby too. And then I think these are the last letters I'll share. This one is a fabulous letter. Right, Kizzy had the impudence to say, so this is a very cold winter. It's 30 below and snow is inside their house. They don't have any insulation. It's a fairly miserable time and everyone is sick, right? And Billy is enslaved and Melissa gets upset because Billy stays too close to the fire and sometimes singes his clothes. And she says, don't you think Kizzy had the impudence to say to me that she thought Billy and he and Osborne done a heap of hard work in the winter. I didn't used to think Kizzy would ever show such resentment and temper as she does sometimes. I can take her down, which lasts a little while, but she has so much sulkings. I lay it to Osborne's training, and I fear they will train up their children to trouble. So here she's Melissa's writing that she's beating Kizzy and blames her husband Osborne for provoking Kizzy to behave this way that therefore necessitates a beating, right? This woman is beating Kizzy and blaming her husband and fearing about their children, and basically complains that she's a bad mother, right? Her baby burnt his hand, and I was dressing it, says Melissa, and I gave it up to Kizzy to do, but she says it's too much trouble for her. And so I'm just not going to bother. Another letter, she has a stillborn baby. So basically, these kinds of stories over time, essentially what I found is three things that I want to highlight overall. The first is these collections of letters, they are mostly written between women, although some men are represented in these collections as authors. They mostly write about their own families and their own stories. But by reading them carefully, you can actually find stories about enslaved people too. Kizzy is one of those people. And I found that to be fascinating that you could find her story through these letters. The second thing overall is, and there's a limit to how many letters I wanted to share with you all today, well, maybe I should just conclude so you know that I'm concluding. The second thing overall out of these three things I wanted to talk about is that in these letters, you fairly frequently find white people, but particularly white women, because most of the letters I read were written by women, blaming enslaved women for being bad mothers. They wrote often that they were careless or neglectful, or any of these things, right? Kizzy didn't take proper care of her baby's hand. Hetty fell asleep on top of her baby. And there's this rhetoric of carelessness. There's a language of neglect and carelessness that comes into these letters. At the same time as white women are blaming Black women for being bad mothers, they are also demanding that these same women care for white children. So there's this dichotomy here between these enslaved women are forced to care for white children and are also being blamed for being bad mothers to their own children. Finally, I didn't talk too much about wet nursing, but I will say this. In the early modern period in Europe, people thought that breast milk was a form of blood, right? It's like there's a lot of texts from 1600s, 1500s, 1700s on, that breast milk is blood transformed. This is particularly fascinating in the case of families, white families using enslaved Black wet nurses, because the idea is that if babies are drinking breast milk, they are actually drinking a form of blood. And if that is true, there is this underlying sort of concern that white families have that their white babies will darken and become somehow Blacker through drinking the breast milk of a Black woman. However, this stops some people from doing it, and they explicitly, I don't want to do this. Other people continue to do this, but as they're doing it, this practice essentially undermines ideas about racial difference while they are also insisting on racial difference. So it wet nursing complicates ideas about biological differences between white and Black people as white babies are drinking Black women's milk. And even as that's happening, white people are insisting more firmly on differences between white and Black people. So, my experience at the Wilson led me to a lot of these letters about wet nursing, letters about enslaved mothers, letters about enslaved women's health. And through all that, I have tried to weave together a story that is ultimately an article under review and that is also going to end up as part of my next book project. So I will end there for now and happy to take questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. That was really fascinating. I look forward to the question period at the end. So our next conversation is going to be with Virlana Shchuka. And Virlana, like Kate, was also a visiting researcher. And her fellowship was funded by the Guion Griffiths Johnson Fund. The talk that she's going to be giving today is called Tracing Labor Complications and Maternal Guilt in the 19th Century American South. Virlana is an SSHRC-funded postdoctoral fellow and assistant director at the Department of English and Comparative Literature's Health and Humanities Lab. Her main research project intersects medical literacy and cultural narratives to uncover how childbirth and postnatal health challenges were understood and represented in the 18th and 19th centuries, and how such knowledge might inform the way that we think about experiences of labor complications in today's care context. With an interdisciplinary STEM and humanities background, Virlana's broader interest in the health humanities extends to histories of bibliotherapy and narrative-based interventions in healthcare. So that's a short introduction. And now here is Virlana's talk.
Thank you. Is my screen visible?
Yes, it looks perfect.
Fantastic. Okay. Thank you. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to share some of my archival findings from the Wilson Library. Just before continuing, as the title of my talk suggests, I will delve into some emotionally difficult topics related to childbirth, including maternal mortality, fetal disability, and infant loss. So for anyone on the call who might prefer not to engage with these topics, the latest point to leave the call would probably be around slide number 10. That is partway through my discussion of the letters from the Skinner family collection. That said, I do promise, even with the heavy subject matter, this talk is not without some happier and beauty transcending adversity moments. So just following from Matt's introduction to my research position and interests, I will just add that whenever I describe what I do to a family member or a new colleague for the first time, I usually get the so what question. Why are you studying what you're studying? And I'm especially interested in how historical attitudes to labor complications might inform our understanding of the maternal guilt phenomenon in our own time. So this is a phenomenon of chronic guilt and recurrent self-blame experienced by many women and sometimes extended family members when infants are born earlier or in a way that's different from what was expected. So better understanding and potentially mitigating this phenomenon using this kind of historical knowledge is the big picture application of my work. If we turn to existing scholarship surrounding reproductive health discourses from 2 or 3 centuries past, we get some idea of what it might have been like to go into labor at this time and how women actively participated in and responded to their epoch's birthing care practices. And among these works, Nora Doyle's Maternal Bodies itself draws upon several Wilson Library materials to reconstruct childbirth experiences from the earliest years of the United States. Now, the value of the approaches in these works include the uncovering of historical abuses in women's medical treatment, and specifically the resurrecting of women's voices. So that allows us access to women's particular perspectives of their embodied experiences. At the same time, such a critical approach can sometimes leave a broad-brushed impression of women at the mercy of the stereotypical cold-hearted medical man and the husband concerned only with his wife's producing an heir for him with no regard for her own health. And that's not to say that such attitudes and neglect and care did not exist. They certainly did. But this also wasn't reflective of every medical encounter between a male physician and a female patient, or every home environment between husband and wife. And in fact, Heather Meek and Sarah Fox, while acknowledging historical medical atrocities in women's care, have complicated these strictly gender-defined conclusions. And from their examinations of individual cases and the roles that practitioners, spouses, and extended family members frequently played in women's care, both their monographs, here displayed on the right side, both their monographs begin to address the call for a more nuanced critical picture of women's care experiences in earlier historical periods. Now, I'm also interested in this relational dimension of obstetric care. And as a result, my research naturally gravitates towards a health humanities research framework because of its consideration of a wide range of social, environmental, and relational factors that might inform a particular health event or journey. My approach partakes in psychiatrist Arthur Kleinman's characterization of illness, one that extends beyond just the patient to the members of the family or the patient's wider social network, and taking into account how they all perceive, live with, and respond to the patient's symptoms. So this kind of perspective suggests the broader relational environment impacts and can reveal significant insights about a patient's health condition. And indeed, in my research at the Wilson, I drew upon a model used by scholar John Wiltshire in his monograph, where he organizes his analysis around a single illness or recovery experience of an 18th or 19th century historical figure. And then he demonstrates how that health journey extends to a network of individuals beyond merely the patient and the doctor. And then he further goes on to show how that network reveals something new about the experience of that health journey. So to address the question I posed in my library research fellowship, namely how were labor complications and maternal guilt experienced and represented in the 19th century American South, I too approached the Wilson's archival materials, namely personal correspondence and medical records, as health narratives. So I considered the narrative's authors, their correspondence, and referred to individuals in the documents as members of a patient care network. And from this perspective, I examined the effects of these idiosyncratic relational environments on both the mother's experience of pregnancy, labor, and/or postpartum recovery, as well as the reciprocal effects of this health journey with those close to her. So I want to share how this approach offers a window into the psyche of the patient, the care provider, and the extended families during the delivery and reception of obstetric care at this time. Now, in this presentation, I will highlight three particular collections, two concentrating on letter exchanges involving expectant mothers, and one surrounding a practitioner's medical case records. So as I go through the materials, I've included photographs of the original text, but where the handwriting might be a little difficult to decipher, I have added a plain font text version for certain excerpts. So first I will turn to the collection of the Skinner family, a wealthy family that owned many property and plantations based in the northeastern parts of North Carolina. From their personal correspondence, I examined a series of letters written by Penelope Skinner Warren in 1840 to her husband, Thomas Warren, who also happened to be a physician. When Penelope wrote these letters, her husband was based in Edenton, where I believe he was carrying on much of his medical work, while she was based in Hillsborough and expecting her first child. In these letters, she documented her experience of first-time pregnancy symptoms. And at this time, Dr. Thomas Warren was her most frequent letter recipient. Now, beyond the regular updates on physical symptoms and her changing appearance, Penelope also recounted an anecdote with her husband that I'd like to read out loud to you. I had quite an accident yesterday, but it is over. Perhaps I ought to tell you. I observed a dog lying near the door and asked the servants to, sorry, I'm experiencing the same thing. It's cut off on my end, but I asked the servants to call him, I asked the servants to call him into the house, which they did. The dog, however, got away from them. I had my back to the door and, hearing something coming after me, looked behind and saw the dog in the act of springing on me. I was exceedingly frightened, as you may, I think she started to write imagine, but traced off, knowing what a coward I am naturally, and screamed, and on attempting to, I think it's run, I was so much agitated that I do not remember what I did or the dog either. I got up, they brought me in the house, and I got on the bed. Mrs. Johnstone gave me a glass of hartshorn for me to take, and it composed me a great deal. I experienced no pain at all, but was so fearful of the consequences. So I want to draw attention to a number of phrases in this particular anecdote. Even though Penelope has a very open relationship with her husband, going by, if we go by what she has shared with him in previous letters, she initially mentions hesitating to share this experience for fear of causing him anxiety. So even though he's a part of her support network, she does not want to give him that kind of emotional burden. But then she goes on to describe the event. The dog springs on her. Understandably, she's exceedingly frightened. She screams. She attempts to run, falls. Her memory is clouded, and others in and around the house come to her aid. Finally, at the end of the anecdote, she relates she experienced no pain at all, but was at the time fearful of the consequences. So she's not reporting any particular pain symptoms, or rather she's reporting the absence of pain symptoms, but she relates that she's had this strong emotional reaction. So this event has left her very terrified. Now, I would have entirely overlooked this anecdote if not for the fact that this dog reappears several times in her further correspondence, both in the same August 28th letter and in 3 of her subsequent letters. Penelope deems it important enough to mention the dog was sent to the plantation, then repeat again that the dog was sent to the county, and a neighbor, Mr. Whithead, has insisted that the dog should be sent off. And what's slightly ironic is that at one point she writes, I do not think I am any the worse for my fright, as it is all forgotten. And clearly, with this ongoing reference to this dog, she has not forgotten. And in fact, the figure of the dog multiplies. So in a later letter, she writes of her dread of dogs and cows, of their great abundance, and of their crowding the streets of Hillsborough. So I read this accumulation of references to this dog that's haunting her letters as an indicator of trauma, of something that has clearly sat with her, something that involved a community, a network of individuals to assist her during and after the attack. And possibly, I'm speculating, but possibly this could have affected her pregnancy. Sadly, Penelope died in childbirth. Her daughter survived the labor, but the mother, Penelope, did not. Now, this collection does not include the response letters from Penelope's husband, and I am curious to find out whether they have survived and are perhaps kept in a different location, because I've wondered whether her husband keeps following up on this dog in his responses and is therefore keeping the figure of this animal in his wife's mind. But this last letter at the bottom of the slide on September 11th is the only one that Penelope does not write to her husband. This letter is written to her cousin. So I think it's more likely that she was the one who kept proactively bringing up the dog in her letters, perhaps proactively and subconsciously, and focusing on the dogs going away and her steering clear of the other dogs and farm animals as a kind of self-soothing mechanism. So moving from my analysis of letters in this collection, in this case involving a single letter writer and no knowledge of what the response was like, I will turn to my second collection of interest, which includes correspondence to and from Cornelia Phillips Spencer, a writer and community leader with ties to the academic and lawyer circles in Chapel Hill. And here I examine letters pertaining to the pregnancy, stillbirth, and early postpartum recovery of Cornelia's daughter, Julia, who goes by June. These letters detail how those events were experienced by June herself and by her husband, James Lee Love, in Massachusetts, where the couple was based, and by Cornelia, who remained in Chapel Hill over the course of this correspondence. So here I focus on the network of the three correspondents: the patient, the spouse, and the mother. And partway through June's pregnancy, one of the reoccurring points in the letter exchange between her and her mother is how much June wanted her mother's physical presence during the time of her pregnancy. She writes how she misses her mother, how upset it makes her that her mother can't essentially not, I suppose at this time, not carpool, but carriage pool with a family that happens to be coming up soon to Massachusetts. And she expresses what she calls homesickness and mama sickness together. Then in a later letter, she's more direct, writing, "You ought to be here anyway." So there's a sense of growing frustration that her mother isn't there, that she isn't responding to this particular emotional health need that June has. In her own turn, Cornelia also reacts with frustration to this particular point, writing, "I wish you had not said all you did about my not being with you. Nothing would have kept me if I were not deaf. That's what keeps me," where she is based. So within the support that Cornelia tries to give her daughter from afar, she brings up the state of her own health, responding to June's sickness claims with an assertion of her own chronic health challenges and her own position as a patient. So not just as a support network member, but also as someone who is dealing with her own chronic health journey herself. Now, on March 31st of 1891, June's husband Lee has to deliver the painful news to Cornelia. Lee informs her first that June is safely through her labor, and then he focuses on June's good naps and resting before relaying that their daughter was stillborn and had hydrocephaly. Now, hydrocephaly in particular was a condition that motivated many practitioners in the mid to late 19th century to draw affected infants of the mothers whom those physicians attended. So drawings like these from the Wilson Library's Hens collection, I think, are a visual indicator of practitioners trying to collect information and trying to find patterns among individual cases to make sense of how this condition comes about, because very little was known about how and why this happens. Now, Lee's letters very much reflect his concern for June's recovery, not only from a physical, but from a mental and emotional health perspective. He writes to Cornelia, "June feels the loss more keenly than," first he writes "many," and then he crosses it out and writes "either of us can," which I think is a way of more clearly articulating and expressing both his and Cornelia's intimacy with June, and foregrounding how important their roles are in June's patient support network. He also asks Cornelia to write as cheerfully as you can and as soon as you can, underlining that last phrase, which suggests that he's very familiar with how much June depends on Cornelia for the maternal support that only Cornelia can give. And Lee also reiterates that he's so glad and grateful to have June, and again, glad and grateful to have her. Her here is underlined, safely through the ordeal. So I think Lee is one of many historical examples of husbands and fathers who cared for and proactively supported their wives through difficult labors and postpartum as best as they could. And reading Lee's letters reflects a deep sense of awareness about June's feelings about the loss of their child. So in this same letter, he writes, "The fear that we are disappointed troubles her more than her own disappointment." And in a later later letter, he writes more explicitly, the loss has not been, in my opinion, in any sense due to carelessness or any other thing she could have prevented. She has been careful and thoughtful all the time. She did the best she could, which was the best anybody could do, and it was not her fault. Now, the strength and conviction in that phrase, and it was not her fault, taking into account everything that he's described beforehand, is very much suggestive of that classic maternal guilt and self-blame. So just to be clear, Lee is not responding to any claim from Cornelia that even remotely suggests June might be personally responsible. So this is very much Lee giving us an insight into what June is thinking and responding accordingly in a letter to her mother with what we might imagine he is orally communicating to June. June, this is not your fault. This is not your fault. As he tries to comfort her, and which he is then reiterating in his correspondence to his mother-in-law. So again, this is one of many archival examples across the history of childbirth research where the husband takes on a significant role as his wife's primary emotional caregiver during and after her labor. Now, in a still later letter, Lee offers Cornelia the attending physician's retroactive diagnosis, citing June's being run down and her depressed condition as contributing factors to the loss of their daughter. Now, much can be said here regarding the default to depression and anything that kind of falls under the umbrella of stress and anxiety to explain away any medical unknown, which was very common both in that particular historical period and in our own historical moment. But I want to focus on the connection Lee makes between these physical and emotional symptoms and their situational context. He does not elaborate on what his and June's misfortunes in Chapel Hill were in this letter, but in one of June's earliest letters to Cornelia since losing the baby, we get a more detail-laden perspective on what she interprets as the cause of this loss. So she writes, "No wonder the poor little baby died. I was half distracted last summer and fall. The doctor said the state of my mind then began the mischief. The fall had finished it. How could I have helped it? I was nearly heartbroken at leaving you and our home." And it's cut off, but further circumstances and the thought of what would come and our impecunious state all drove me wild. Nobody realized it, but as I kept going, I thought it was all right. So here we in part loop back to those early longings on June's part for her mother's presence with her during her pregnancy, as part and parcel of a potential cause for why this labor outcome why they received the labor outcome that they received. And we also get ties to the anxieties linked to finances and uncertainties about the future that might have harmed both June and her child. So again, we have a bit of a window into that broader social and environmental context that informs this post-event diagnosis, whether that diagnosis has any bearing in what actually happened or not. Finally, I want to share my findings from the Hentz collection, which included the medical records of obstetrician Charles Hentz and his perspectives on the labors of his patients. He appears to have attended patients across multiple states from Ohio to Kentucky and Louisiana. And in his mid-19th century case records, he provides a numerical listing of the patients he has attended, typically writing a very succinct entry about each case with very few details apart from usually the patient's name, the geographical location, the mode of delivery if it was a particularly difficult labor, as well as the health and life outcome for mother and child. But some cases, particularly those involving labor complications and some preterm birth deliveries, we receive a little bit more textured insight into the practitioner's posture towards his patient. So for instance, he records the premature labor of a Mrs. Johnson and noting that she delivered of a 7 months child. So this is a preterm birth. And he writes about her consequent death. But he also thinks it important enough to note some aspects of her domestic environment before he writes about the nature of this delivery. The entry starts with poor woman dash many children dash drunken husband. So there is, even in this brief little line, a suggestion of concern for her home life situation, and the presence of this information in this entry suggests that he's connecting that environment with at least her labor outcome, if not her death. In another case of a Mrs. Jeffries, Hens writes about her very long history of miscarriages before he records the details of a difficult labor that involved excessive hemorrhaging. Labor hemorrhaging cases are very prevalent at this time, and this was something that practitioners were very mindful of needing to address, and they had to be ready to address anytime they visited a potential patient. So Hens then appends an interesting addendum in pencil that isn't very clear from this image, but he writes, I used my pocket, or rather, there's no I. He writes, used my pocket handkerchief in the tamponing, a splendid large linen handkerchief sacrificed. Now, when I first read this, my immediate gut reaction was, this woman is hemorrhaging profusely in front of you, and you're lamenting the loss of your handkerchief. So this could be read as quite an insensitive and inhumane addition. But it's also possible to read this differently. This part was likely added even later than the main entry. So there is, we can very safely assume that there's a significant temporal distance from the chaotic stress of the actual labor event in the time that he's writing this. And he may possibly have even taken pride in using an object that could have had sentimental value for him to save a life in an emergency situation. I mean, apart from the absence of emoticons, we simply don't know. So this could be interpreted in a couple of different ways. And finally, my personal favorite case entry involves, I believe it's a Mrs. Hoteford, where Hens labels her delivery as a tedious labor case, but then adds, and I think I'm reading this correctly, delivered sitting in her husband's lap. So I'd like to conclude with this image because of its conveyed sense of a very intimate form of support from the husband to the wife, and the close involvement of the physician, which is physically the closest one I've ever come across in both in my own research and from what I've seen in existing scholarship. And just to wrap up, the materials from all three collections, I think, exemplify the complex nature of obstetric care delivery and reception within these patient networks, and the consideration of these documents from a health humanities perspective. I hope I've shown, whether focusing on Penelope Skinner Warren's haunting dog, or June's maternal guilt through the lens of her husband, or Hens's glimpse into the labors of his patients. I think this consideration offers a little more insight into the experiences of labor complications in this period. So I too would like to thank Matt and all the librarians at the Wilson Library for this research opportunity. Thank you to everyone who joined for my talk, and I'm happy to take questions.
Well, thank you. This has been sometimes you really hope that you can put two people sort of in conversation with each other, even though your time here wasn't exactly at the same time. So while we wait for people to ask questions, and there's a Q&A box that people can type into directly, or you could raise your hand and I think Nadia can allow you to speak. But I wondered first if Virlana or Kate, if you had questions for each other, given some of the similarities in your interests and the work that you've done here.
Well, I actually just, and I may have missed this, but I know that you were looking at these stories in in the 19th century American South while you were at the Wilson. What is your larger, do you have like, are you focused just on that? Or like, what is your kind of your scope for the larger project?
Yeah, so my current monograph project focuses mostly on preterm birth and maternal guilt. So something that makes a connection between one and the other. And I'm looking at it from the perspective of um, well, multiple texts, medical texts, novels, legal documents, and personal correspondence. Um, of course, the challenge with this kind of work is, and I don't expect to find something like this, but I it's very unlikely that I will open an archive and see a woman who's written, "I delivered prematurely and I feel really guilty about it." So yeah, like as you know from your own work, and from a lot of what you presented today, there's a lot of reading between the lines. There's a lot of dependence on what other people are saying about someone else rather than hearing a first person perspective. But I am trying, the thread in my current work is tracing kind of history of why there is such a strong association between labor complications and maternal guilt, because I don't think it's just biological. So that's kind of the running thread. In terms of the work that I've done at the Wilson, I've debated whether to, certainly components of that would go into the book, but I've debated whether to go with a more traditional research article format that does this kind of close reading, in-depth analysis of a handful of correspondences in the collection. So I've debated between that and going with perhaps a different kind of end product format, and I'm not quite sure what that would look like, but that's still sitting in my mind. So
And you're looking at the US?
I'm looking at Anglo-America, so Britain and the US, but I'd really like to expand my US focus, because apart from what I've done in the Wilson, everything that I've found so far has been from England, Scotland, Ireland, and France.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess I wanted to ask, because I've done a little bit of work on breastfeeding in the late 18th century, though not quite with the same focus. But I was wondering if there was any kind of sensibility from the mid 19th century onwards about like, was there any encouragement for white women to breastfeed their own children rather than um, relying on wet nurses to feed their children?
Yeah, I mean, basically, since for hundreds of years, there's people like mostly first starting with mostly male physicians being like, women, these white women. First, it was these elite women because it was in England where pretty much all the women were white, and in France. So physicians in England and in France, a few women and midwives, and some men saying elite women need to nurse, like breastfeed their own children, and going on about this right from sort of early 1600s. And this kind of picks up steam, increases over the course of the 18th century. In places like France, you have influential texts like Rousseau's Emile, where he is going on about how people need to breastfeed their children, and ignores all of his own children who he ships off to orphanages. But this happens in Anglo-America, in France, in England. Yes, people are like, elite white women need to nurse their own children. And so some of the work that historians have done recently have sort of a little bit pushed back against that, about like, well, why would people have used wet nurses? And sometimes it's like one of the examples I showed today, because the woman can't, right? Or she dies. There are examples of people who die. And other times, in another example I showed today, because we don't exactly know why, but it doesn't seem like the woman tried or wanted to in the first place and is like, yeah, sure, there's all this prescriptive literature telling me to, but I'm not going to do that.
And so I was curious whether like you haven't come across any examples of someone writing, for example, my husband wants me to wet nurse, but darn it, I'm gonna do it myself because I want to.
I haven't.
Like that
I've
in the 18th
definitely,
century, but I wasn't sure about a bit later.
yeah, I mean, I've come across it in secondary literature where people are like, well, husbands wanted their wives to use wet nurses sometimes because there's a prescription, there's ideas that say, well, you shouldn't have sex if you're nursing. And so husbands were like, hey, stop nursing. But I have not personally come across those letters by women saying that.
I was wondering, Kate, given when you were talking about the sort of racial anxiety that wet nursing produced, do you see manifestations of that in letters by women, or is this a larger sort of debate that isn't really you're not seeing in this sort of intimate space?
Yeah, that's a great question. Of course, I would love to get the smoking gun that says this. And I went in because there was a letter that, so a couple of people have used the Southern Historical Collection to write about wet nursing. Verlana mentioned Nora Doyle. Also, earlier in like a few decades before, Sally McMillan used it. And she actually cites somebody who says, I feel really not sure if it's right to use this wet nurse or not. And so I went in and I looked at the letter, but I'm pretty sure it's a white woman because the letter says, like, oh, Sally Hollinell just can't get her milk to dry up. You know what great quantities she always has. And, she asked if I would be willing to let her nurse my baby. And I'm not really sure if it's right or not. And so the one sort of manifestation of doubt that kind of I'd seen in the literature turned out to be like, I'm not really sure that this is an enslaved woman. Um, so in a sense, no, but yes, in smaller ways, right? So there's like a letter from a man, and he's like, I really hope that my wife doesn't use a wet nurse because I just find it really unnatural to see white babies at Black women's breasts. And then there's a letter from a woman, and she's like, I really don't want to use a wet nurse because um, it it feels wrong to me. And again, I think she uses the word unnatural. And then she's also afraid that she's afraid of retaliation, right? She's afraid that if she gives this enslaved woman essentially power over her own child, that this enslaved woman can do what she wants with the baby. And there's stories of wet nurses, enslaved wet nurses who, like rare stories, but occasional stories elsewhere, right, of what enslaved wet nurses who are accused of killing white babies. It's rare. I haven't seen any in the 19th century South, but it is a concern that sometimes women raise. And then the other concern that they raise is that, and this is from men and women, they're afraid actually just of proximity, that white babies will come to resemble Black wet nurses, but also just Black women in general if they're around them too much, right? That they're going to somehow become, affected by both maybe through biology, but also through proximity and through imitation, because there's early modern texts being like, well, everyone knows that babies imitate their nurses. So if your nurse scowls, your baby is going to scowl. Um, so putting all the pieces together, you see this, but it's not always a direct connection. There's a diary entry from the 1700s where and this is elite women, right? But they uh, go from South Carolina to England, and Princess Augusta is like, you use a black wet nurse and your baby is so fair complexioned. Wow. Like, so
Mhm.
there's bits and pieces to put together, but there aren't women directly always speaking to this.
Thank you. I was going to read a few of the questions that we've gotten in the comments. First, John Blythe is thanking you both for your presentations, and I think we would all echo that. This is actually the most fun that we have with fellows. It's not that you're not a delight in the research room, but this is a lot of fun for us. John writes, Kate, I'm interested in your mention of viewing breast milk as blood. Did you find papers at Wilson where there is a discussion slash concerns about the mixing of milk and blood? And how do the writers explain their decision to go ahead and rely on Black women to breastfeed their white children? So that's John.
Yeah, thank you for your question. It's a great question. So one of the things I've struggled with a little bit is figuring out when this language shifts. So early modern European texts, many of them talk about how breast milk is a form of blood. Um, the papers in the Wilson, I did not find that. And the papers in the Wilson I was looking at were mostly 1840s and 1850s. And there's a big leap between, 1600s, 1700s to the 1840s and 1850s. Um, but there was something I was reading just today or yesterday. I was looking through all of these letters again. And it was more about, I had this thought just a minute ago, like a second ago, during the question. Not so much about mixing blood, and milk, but there is concern about like, I don't, I, oh, right, your question about how they justify doing it anyway. So there's concern about, if not directly writing about milk and blood, there's concern about white babies somehow becoming blacker through proximity to Black nurses and wet nurses. Um, the way most white women who use Black wet nurses don't bother to justify it. I was looking at a letter earlier that was sort of like, I wish that I could hire more white servants, but I can't afford them because their wages are too expensive. And so we continue to rely on enslaved Black people. And maybe we're just doing what our parents did, and we're raising our children the way that our parents raised us. And this is coming, so there's like different sisters, and some of them are using wet nurses and some of them are not. Some of them are nursing their own children. But one of the sisters who is sometimes, she does both. She nurses her own children and then relies on enslaved wet nurses, is the one saying like, it's just that this is the way our parents raised us. And so this is what we think is right. And this is what we do. So I haven't found the blood milk thing directly at the Wilson. But most of the time they're not really justifying it. They're just sort of like, this is what we do. I don't know if that answers the question or not, but it's a good one.
Thank you. This is an interesting one, given both of your work, and especially I think Virlana for your some of the work you were looking at in Europe. My colleague Laura Hart, who spends most of her professional life describing and really thinking about the words that people use, says that in examining a recent collection, she came across the term monthly nurse listed as an occupation of an enslaved woman. And have either of you come across this term? And does it signify anything in particular to you? She goes on to say that her mind went to surveillance of enslaved women's menstruation. Perhaps she's sort of framing it in a post 2025, post Dobbsian world. But does monthly nurse recollect anything in your work?
I've never come across that term, so unfortunately, I'm not very helpful. I'd have to review the letters and look for that specifically though, because maybe I hadn't. It might well have popped up and I just overlooked it, but yeah. Yes,
Thanks.
I have nothing to contribute for this question.
And I actually have not come across it either, at all. Although my hunch would be, I mean, depending on the context, and maybe because I don't know, that it would have more to do with like like a white woman's monthly cycles, that it would be that she wouldn't nurse maybe while menstruating in some ways because both are considered draining of your body, right? And so um you would sort of take a couple days off, and but that's that's also hard to imagine how that would work, like biologically,
Mm.
physiologically. Nursing women, you can't just really like take a few days off and then go back to it. And then the woman, the enslaved woman on the other end, can't just like nurse for a couple days a month, right? Presumably it's somebody who's also nursing her own child, of course. But I don't know. That's a really fascinating term. I don't know it, but I'd really be interested in learning more.
Um,
Me too.
Afterwards, Laura provides very helpfully a citation, and it's probably digitized so that we can share that with you both if you're interested.
I would
Um,
love.
the last question, I know we're getting a little tight. Do you still have a few minutes? Okay. The last question is from an anonymous attendee, and they want to know what is the most shocking finding you both found through your research here?
Most shocking.
I can mention two, not terribly shocking, but quite surprising, given the like what I knew going into the Wilson. I mentioned Sarah Fox's work that came out 3 years ago. Her giving birth in 18th century England has been really enlightening in terms of just how, again, how active husbands could be, even across classes in the care of their wives when it came to pregnancy, labor, postpartum. And I did see a lot of that also in the archives. There are um, a lot of husbands who are very keen in the letters to know like just everything that their wife is going through. They want their wives to share absolutely everything with them, from the first time that she feels a baby's kicking to, like what she's eaten that day. Um, and there's very much a sense I get that it's not about, I'm looking at you as a receptacle, like carrying my my future son. Like it's very much like I care about you and you're in a more vulnerable state. And I want to know how things are with you. And just kind of paired with that, what's surprised me is a lot of women were much more open about their physical symptoms than I expected. At least when I've looked at late 18th century, early 19th century English letters, there does tend to be, and Sarah Fox makes a note of this as well, a kind of reserve about, we're not going to go into graphic information about anything, but there were many letter writers across the Wilson collections that were very open about stomach symptoms and bowel issues. So I remember those are one of those moments where I thought, whoa, that's very unexpected and kind of nice in a way that they felt they could be vulnerable enough about those things and not be worried about what their husbands were thinking. So yeah.
And I don't know if this is my most shocking finding, but it was something that surprised me. Mine's very different, which is so these siblings whose letters I've been reading a lot of. So there's Melissa and Cecilia and Louisa and Thomas. Their father is Placebo Houston, who was a postmaster in Iredell, North Carolina. And he was a significant enslaver, right? And all of his children enslaved people and was a significant slaveholder. And then I believe it was him, right? I'm pretty sure it was him. He remarried after his wife died. And I don't know if he moved or not. And now I could be slightly off here because I have these in my notes, but I have to check my notes. But in his will, when he died, he basically said, I want all of my slaves to be freed and go to Liberia, and said I would like to send them all to Liberia. And I think that was him. And then his children mounted this campaign fighting this tooth and nail, trying to prove that he was out of his mind, that he was crazy, that he was, to connect with what Virlana just said, incontinent, and that this proved that he was therefore mentally unfit to make a decision, and that actually they should inherit these people, and those people should not go to Liberia. And this goes on for a long time, and I think in the end they don't go to Liberia. But I was surprised to find that.
Yeah, that would be interesting to know more about his rationale for that. Yeah, interesting. I wish we had more time. We're a little bit over. I'd like to really thank you both and encourage you to reach out to us, in the future if you have any other questions that we can try to help you with. We'll be meeting. Oh, Sarah? I thought I saw a hand. Sorry. Um, the other thing, we'll be meeting in a month again, and we'll be talking on March 12th. And it's really interesting the degree to which medicine has really impacted the fellowship recipients that we've had. So next month, Grace Richter is writing She's a graduate student in George Washington, and she's writing Mothering the South: Gender, Race, and Infant Care, 1800 to 1865. And Kylie Smith at Emory is writing No Place for Children: Disability and Civil Rights in the History of Juvenile Detention. Um, so yeah, it's really become a very strong thematic framework that we're seeing time and time again. So oh, and Nadia's putting the registration. So again, thank you all so much for coming, and I hope to see you next month.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and let me see. Do you both have a second just so we can chat?